So when you see this view, I know you are not thinking about what about Bolivia during World War II, but I am. What about Bolivia during the Second World War? Well, did you know that Bolivia played a very important role during the Second World War? And that is what you're going to learn today. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, my name is Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher. I like to make videos about history on location for you. And right now in these beautiful mountains in Bolivia. If you find this content interesting, please consider subscribing, hit that notification bell. And if you are from Bolivia, let me know what you think about this video. Leave a comment, leave a like. How was a landlocked country like Bolivia involved in a war that was waged on different continents far away? Well, did you know that Bolivia was not always a landlocked country? If you look at this map, for example, you can see that Bolivia, over the course of the 19th and 20th century, lost territory to its neighbors. And it lost its coastal province, the littoral, to Chile in the aftermath of the War of the Pacific, 1879-1883. Here the country fought with Peru against Chile. The discovery of nitrates, critical for gunpowder and fertilizer in the contested area in the hands of Bolivia and Peru, led to an armed conflict in which Chile triumphed. And to this day, both Peruvians and Bolivians feel strongly about their lost territories. In the first half of the 1930s, Bolivia saw war against Paraguay. This conflict is known as the Chaco War or the Grand Chaco War. Incidents had already been occurring since the late 1920s, and it escalated into a full-blown war over the Chaco Boreal, a wilderness region of about 100,000 square miles, around 260,000 square kilometers. Despite Bolivia having a bigger population and thus a bigger army, more manpower, better weapons, and a German general on their side named Hans von Kunt, who had trained the Bolivian army, the Paraguayans managed to halt them. The war became a stalemate and a truce was signed in 1935. Bolivian losses were huge. 65,000 of the 250,000 man army were killed, deserted or perished in captivity, with a population loss of only 2 million. Bolivian per capita losses came close to French and British losses in the First World War. The war basically ended because Bolivian President Daniel Salamanca was overthrown and replaced by José Luis Tejera Sorzano, who favored peace. After the war, many of the Bolivian middle-class intellectuals started to question the traditional leadership of their country. Bolivia was a country of huge inequality and infighting. On one hand, there were the mestizos, those of European background, and on the other hand, there were the natives, colloquially known as the Indians. And we saw this during the Chaco War, where the mestizo leadership sent the natives to fight their war. A definitive peace treaty was signed in 1937 and most of the Chaco region went to Paraguay. Due to the outbreak of World War II, Bolivia and the United States got closer than ever before. And that had to do with the impact on the global tin market. And already before World War II broke out, the tin prices went up and the US feared a severe tin shortage. And that's where Bolivia came in, because the country was rich in tin resources. The US tin buffer stock was quickly exhausted and the London metals market closed with no ready supply to meet the sudden demand. The US devoted more attention to the Western Hemisphere with the goal of reducing Axis influences and also secure the supplies of essential raw materials. And many Latin American countries were happy with US economic assistance that could help them recover their depression-ravaged economies. During the 1939 Panama Conference, which took place several weeks after the outbreak of World War II, foreign ministers of all these sovereign nations in North and South America came together with the purpose to establish a common policy regarding the war. The Bolivians proposed an aid for tin deal, but were informed no loans would be forthcoming without prior compensation to Standard Oil. Standard Oil was a US company that exploited oil in the Chaco region. Standard Oil's interest in the region were a contributing factor to the conflict. After the war, the Bolivian government seized several assets of the company, which outraged the North Americans. A month before, Bolivian President Herman Bush had committed suicide over the issue, although some claim it was an assassination. He was succeeded by Carlos Quintanilla as interim president. In April 1940, Enrique Peñaranda took office. At the end of 1940, the US signed a 5-year tin contract with Bolivian producers to buy 18,000 tons annually at a fixed price, which was actually quite low. From this moment till the 1950s, the US would buy half of Bolivia's tin concentrates. Speaking about mines, did you know that in 1938 mining baron Maurice Hochschild persuaded then President Bush to allow the admittance of Jewish refugees escaping Nazi persecution in Europe? Between 1938 and 1941, more than 20,000 European Jews were granted visas and emigrated to Bolivia. And then it was July 1941 and the US ambassador handed a letter to the Bolivian government. In it were the details of a supposed pro-Axis plot, a Nazi putsch, as you will. The Bolivian government responded fast. The German ambassador was proclaimed persona non grata. A state of siege was decreed, anti-government people were locked up, and the press was censored. Later it turned out that the letter had been a forgery of British agents. This Nazi plot benefited both the US, Great Britain and Bolivia. At that moment, the US was not actively involved in the Second World War yet, but it brought both the US and Bolivia closer to the Allied cause. The Bolivian government could now strengthen its position by cracking down on the opposition, reducing German influence and guaranteeing tin supplies for the US. The Bolivians nationalized their German-run airline, and with US assistance they could improve communication and transportation facilities and could expand and diversify agricultural productions, stimulate mining and stabilize the currency. In September 1941, the two nations signed their first military assistance pact, and in December that year a land lease agreement followed, allocating $11 million in armaments to Bolivia. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the official US entry in World War II, a conference took place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where foreign ministers of Pan-American nations came together to discuss the state of war and the active threat to the Western Hemisphere. The United States and Bolivia signed agreements settling the Standard Oil case, and as a result, North American dollars began to flow into Bolivia for highway projects and a public health program in the rubber and quinine zones. In April 1943, Vice President Henry Wallace visited Bolivia, and while being in La Paz, his host declared war on the Axis powers. Bolivia would not send troops to fight on the front. 1 month later, in Washington, Bolivian President Enrique Peñaranda met with US President Franklin Roosevelt, discussed post-war economic plans, and signed the Declaration of the United Nations. In previous European wars, the United States had championed neutral trade rights. Now a belligerent itself, the United States quickly moved to monopolize the hemisphere's essential resources, in Bolivia's case tin, cinchona, bark for quinine, tungsten, zinc, lead, and rubber. And of these, tin was the most important. And as said before, Bolivia had huge quantities of tin. The Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, was a major exporter of tin as well. But in the early months of 1942, the Dutch East Indies was conquered by Japan. And thus these markets were cut off for the Allies, and Bolivia became the only secure source for tin. The goal of the US was to get as much tin for the lowest price. Bolivia wanted to take advantage of the situation and drive up the price, but at the end the US held the high cards. Bolivian tin production rose fast from around 25,000 tons in 1938 to 42,000 in 1945, which was around half the world's tin production. The tin markets had always been a political issue in Bolivia, and it led to new political dynamics in Bolivia itself. The opposition to the 1940 contract with the US was united in a new movement, Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario. They exploited the dissatisfaction among those who had to work in the mines, because the working conditions in the Bolivian mines were, well, to put it mildly, not very good. Yes, employment and wages rose, but so did inflation, and strikes were the result. In late 1942, it came to a clash with the army, where 30 mine workers were killed by the Bolivian army, known as the Catabi Massacre. According to others, more than 100 miners were killed. And labor militancy threatened the supplies of tin to the US. So therefore, the North Americans, they sent a commission to the Bolivian mines to investigate the situation. They wrote a report criticizing the working conditions severely. Things had to change. The US emphasized the need for bilateral collaboration in the areas of agriculture, health, sanitation, worker housing, and education. More political upheaval would occur because at the end of 1943 a coup d'etat took place in Bolivia. The MNR joined a dissident faction of military officers headed by Gualberto Villarroel, and President Peñaranda was overthrown. After a brief house arrest, he was sent into exile. Villarroel became the new president. The new regime that emerged was a military junta led by the unknown Major Gualberto Villarroel, who was neither a war hero nor a major figure in the military socialist era. However, much of the junta felt sympathies for the Axis cause. By 1944, the realities of the situation required them to moderate their expectations. The US Secretary of State Gordon Hull sent a message to other South American nations stating the US would not recognize the Villarroel government, claiming it was pro-fascist and anti-Semitic. The evidence for this was mostly circumstantial, but Hull had a point. What he feared most were the existing mineral contracts with Bolivia, because these should not be endangered as the war was still going on and the US was in the constant need of minerals. Take the cinchona bark, for example, used to produce quinine against malaria. It was also produced in Peru. Mid-19th century, Dutch and British smugglers carried the seeds out of Peru and established quinine plantations on Java. With Java under Japanese occupation, early 1942, the Allies turned to Peru and Bolivia. Yet with the development of synthetic quinine, the need for this material lessened. In June 1944, the relations with the Villarroel government were restored and talks about the mineral contracts began from scratch. Yet the Bolivian initiative was frustrated at every turn, and this brought instability in the Villarroel government. By mid-1945, President Roosevelt had passed away and the war in Europe had come to an end. The US then offered take it or leave it terms to Bolivia, and the Bolivians knew that once the war was over, the need for their minerals would lessen. An economic crisis laid ahead. Over the previous 6 years, the United States had intervened directly in Bolivia's internal affairs on several occasions and in a variety of ways, but it had also promised long-term commitments to Bolivia's development. These commitments were products of a particular historical moment, when the discourse between two distant neighbors was as focused as it might ever be. After the war, Nazi war criminals made their way to South America, and Bolivia was visited by war criminal Barbie. Not her, I'm talking about Klaus Barbie, who was nicknamed the Butcher of Leon. He had personally tortured prisoners, primarily Jews and members of the French resistance, as head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France. He resided in the Bolivian city Cochabamba for 30 years and obtained Bolivian citizenship. He advised the dictatorial regimes on how to repress opposition. In 1983, Barbie was arrested in La Paz and extradited to France, where he was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment. A very interesting example was Hans Ertl, who had worked on the set of Leni Riefenstahl's documentary film Olympia. From 1939 till 1945, he served as a war correspondent for the Third Reich. He was assigned to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel during the North Africa campaign. In the mid-1950s, he left for South America and settled in Bolivia. Interesting enough was that his daughter, Monica Ertl, joined the communist guerrilla group, the National Liberation Army, the ELN, led by Che Guevara. After Che's death, Monica continued her activities and allegedly assassinated the colonel that was involved in the death of Che Guevara. In 1973, she was ambushed and killed by Bolivian forces. Her father said he was relieved that she had gone in peace. Hans Ertl passed away in the year 2000. With World War II over, the United States disengaged from Bolivia. It would seek closer ties again with the outbreak of the Korean War several years later. Bolivia witnessed much internal upheaval after World War II. During the 1946 La Paz riots, Villarroel was lynched and hanged in public. And in 1952, liberals, communists united themselves with the MNR, and this led to the Bolivian national revolution. Now in power, the MNR issued wide-ranging reforms introducing universal adult suffrage, massive land reform, rural education, and the nationalization of the tin mines. Also, the natives, the majority of the population, were more integrated into the national social structure. A pivotal moment in Bolivia's long-standing history of inequality. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more about other Latin American countries during World War II, I have a video about Paraguay right here and one about Chile right here during World War II. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.